The Tamer is repulsive. Level 18. The War Under the Mountains. 6. The rattan elites advanced behind the onrushing tide of fur-covered, stinky, homicidally insane bodies. The rattan rank and file fanned out through the rubble-strewn streets that once made up the dwarven fortress city, moving with intent and purpose that was heavily laced with blind fury and genocidal anger. The best of each clan had gathered for this onslaught, and even the rank and file were the best of the best from their clans. Only the ones that marched in an orderly fashion behind them were the true elites, the ones taken from each individual clan at birth to be drilled and trained to serve as Ripa's personal army. Fighting raged through the ruined city. Even though the city stretched for just less than 100 miles in all directions, this did not mean there were too few rat men to scour everything. Instead, the massive size of the city meant that the dwarves had more ground to worry about holding, for they were far fewer in number than the rattan menace. The dwarves had reasoned that creating rubble, even at the cost of their own glorious structures, would slow their foe. They were horribly wrong. Dwarves were built like shorter but more burly humans, but the rattan were their same size but far nimbler and lither. Like the rats they were so similar to, they found the debris-strewn streets and shattered structures to be an ideal playground of destruction. Indeed, the dwarves had only done them a favor and themselves a disservice in turning their own home field into one that favored the foe. Like the rats they were so very similar to, a rattan, even when fully grown, could just about slip through any crack they could fit their head through. Therefore, even a rubble designed to block off the dwarven flanks could potentially be bypassed, given enough time and effort. Even if the Under Empire deemed it necessary to rush headlong into the front of a steady, near-unbreakable dwarven shield wall, Ripa had her own idea about how to break the nearly unbreakable. The time to try out her new tactic was approaching sooner than either side had realized. A tavern on the outskirts of a major human city was the host to an old dwarf. He was an exile, an outcast, and a traitor to his people, but he took solace that he had been able to escape the apocalypse that occurred in his homeland. Every night he would come to this tavern, which had a constantly rotating host of travelers and mercenaries, and every night he would tell them tale of the fall of the Ironheart Kingdom and earn a bit of money to keep him from being homeless, hungry, and naked. There was always at least one person who wanted to hear the tale of how he became ostracized and why someone who was once a legendary smith and warrior would never again be viewed as anything other than a trash by his own kind. A young man who had arrived in town of his elderly father was interested in his story, and for a few copper coins the old dwarf now had enough to pay for a drink, another day at the tavern's inn, a day of food. He turned to the people who were itching for the story and began. A few minutes later, and after much urging, he was finally getting to the good part.
The rats were sweeping every pocket of our resistance away. One by one our holdouts in the city fell to the tide of hideous mockeries in the form of the races. There was no difference to the monster whether someone was a warrior or civilian, and knowing that ahead of time was all that was needed to press every single dwarf, both young and old, into service. Still, the sheer barbarity that the vermin showed them was beyond cruel. The rats normally took slaves when it was possible, as they would likely be used for both labor and rations. But this was a level of cruelty and evil beyond anything that had ever been seen before. The survivors of the two kingdoms that had fallen had told tales of brutal slaughters and torture. But what was happening just beyond the range of our great and powerful rifles and crossbows was truly horrific. Dwarves that had been captured would be brought forward and then would be eaten alive in front of the eyes of our brave men. It was like a scene out of a nightmare, and yet we knew we were awake. Maniacal laughter and horrible screaming accompanied the sounds of flesh and bone being ripped and crunched, and some of our number began to lose their cool. But that was what they wanted, those monsters. They want us to give in to rage and righteous fury. They want us to break ranks and charge them. For they knew they could not best a mighty dwarven shield wall. And after hours of the terror and torment continued on and on, with rage building in our hearts and our eyes being nearly clouded by red, the monstrous ratmen stopped their twisted feast. The tide of vermin began to move, and we prepared for the rush. What we did not expect was that they would part and let a procession of rat people unlike any we had ever seen come forth to face us. The rats we had been facing were certainly well disciplined, armed and armored, at least for a rat, but these were something else. Their armors polished to brilliant sheen and had numerous runic etchings that glowed a bright green covering. They were armed with weapons that were unlike those that the rats had normally used. These were purpose-made, not improvised at all. What fur we did see peeking out from under the armor was a deep black, and their eyes were ones that had belonged to a seasoned warrior who had killed many without the slightest remorse. They did not speak. They did not even make a single noise as they advanced, their shields down and their blades aimed straight at us. They stopped just beyond the range of our marksmen, and as if they were a single organism, they began to beat their shields with their blades. Slowly the noise built up, slowly the tempo rose, and then, as if on cue, they charged, still as silent as death. Even as they ran toward us, they moved in lockstep, their feet all hitting the ground at the same time. So stunned by this were we that we did not react fast enough. They already reached the middle range of our crossbows with the shock of it wore off.
Fire!
The command was given and the bolt and bullet flew towards a silvery tide of rat men. Despite the fire they took, they continued moving forward as if they had been nothing sent their way.
Fire!
Another volley managed to connect before they reached us, but the bullets and bolts seemingly did nothing to them. Their shields and ours impacted each other, and then the shoving match began. That is, it began, and then was immediately disrupted. With shit-eating grins on their twisted faces, the lines behind the rats had been pushing crawled onto the shoulders of their fellows and leapt into the midst of our formations. Then the third line of ratmen did the same, followed by the fourth and the fifth, and so on. Soon enough the rats were in and amongst us, tearing through us with strength that would not be out of place if we were fighting our fellow dwarves instead. These monsters continued to jump directly into the middle of our formations, and some even clambered up onto the ruined buildings that were helping us funnel the rats, before jumping to the fray with blades swinging. Eventually, one of the dwarves keeping the shield wall in place fell to a blade in his kidney, and one in his liver. Then another one fell as he was stabbed in the back by the blade of a rat man. One by one, the brothers and sisters that made up the shield wall fell, until at least there were too few dwarves left to keep it up. A single small breach was all that it took for the dam to burst. The single small gaps in the lines allowed the rats to surge through, making the gap wider and wider as more and more the vermin pushed in. It was absolute pandemonium as the silent, silver-covered rat men carved a bloody swath through our forces. It was in the middle of the carnage that I spotted it. A rat-man that hovered above both its own kind and our own, clad in armor and swinging a pair of poison-covered falchions like a murderous whirlwind. The roughly human-sized monster sent limbs, heads, and body parts flying as it silently carved the normal defenders of the kingdom to bits and pieces. I did my best to hold out as long as I could to that point, but when its eyes locked with mine, I was overcome with a fear far greater than any I'd ever faced. I knew then there was no hope for the underkingdoms of our kind. I knew that to try and fight that thing and its forces beyond suicidal. And so, I ran knowing full well that I would forever be a traitor in the eyes of my people, but I did not care, and truth be told, I still do not. I survived, and I'm one of the few dwarves from that doomed land to do so. I can survive, even though I am forever disgraced and forever despised by my own kind. But survival is all that matters. I am not one of those who fell in that hellhole, and I did not fill the belly of some twisted mockery of the races. I am not enslaved to the will of the twisted and cruel rat people, and I am not being used to breed in their generation of slaves and livestock to the monsters down there in the dark. That is my tale of the last days I spent in the Ironheart Kingdom, the last days I spent in the underground, for that matter.
The old dwarf downed his mead and looked at the rest of the people in the tavern. He had been out on the surface for a few years since the fall of the Ironheart Kingdom, since his flight from Oblivion. Every day had been spent looking over his shoulder, paranoid that the rats would come for him. Only in places where there were so many people did he feel safe.
After what felt like a lot longer than it actually was, he managed to find his niche and live in the place that allowed him to live without fear. Mostly. Seriously, rat people the size of dwarves. What do you take us for, you charlatan? Give me back my mead that I bought for you. The old dwarf tossed the empty mug to the young human man and walked out of the tavern, its doors swinging closed behind him. As he walked, the familiar feeling of someone or something following him was ever present in his mind.
Damn, even after all this time, I can't help but be afeard that those monsters will come and silence me. Still, after telling that tale so many times over the long years, I should be long dead by now if they were after me.
All of a sudden, he was pulled into the alleyway, only to see the face of the young man who had bought him some booze in exchange for his story.
Give me back my money, old man!
The dwarf sighed. This kind of thing happened more often than he cared to know. There were always those who did not believe his story, even though it was 100% true.
I don't have a single copper, so just beat me black and blue and be done with it.
No, you wrinkled shit! If I don't get my money...
The man pulled a dagger out of his cloak and drove it toward the dwarf's heart.
Then you don't get to
The man stopped mid-movement with a look of horror on his face.
Pa?
The dwarf looked back and saw a figure cloaked in a leather outfit made of tanned faces. Covering the hooded person's face was the freshly removed skin of an older human man, complete with a beard and eyebrow hair. The young man dropped the dwarf and lunged at the figure, but to the shock and horror of both the human and dwarf, the tail of a large rodent sped out from under the cloak of the face and seized the young man's sword hand. This a single motion. The hooded figure severed the young man's head from his neck and used its tail to toss the body aside like it was a piece of trash. The figure walked up to the dwarf, and as he waited for the end, a feminine yet monstrous voice came from under the human face that adorned that of the human-sized rat person.
Can't have you dying yet. So many more need to hear listen to what happened. You live, and die when we want you to. So don't bother attempt trying to kill die before it is time.
A puff of horribly stinky black smoke later, and the monster was gone, leaving the old dwarf alone with his thoughts and realization that he had never escaped the hell of its own power. He had never escaped the hell to begin with. He was still at their mercy, and not even suicide would be enough to free him. Not that they would even allow him to do so. Despite all his attempts to control and escape his fate, despite his suffering and PTSD, despite the fact that the hell he had witnessed was his only way to earn any money or food, he ultimately was nothing more than a rat in a cage, to be toyed with and abused by the monsters that kept him entrapped.